Are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to Lancaster Farmland Trust 7th webinar in our series about the work that we do every day, as well as some relevant issues and hot topics surrounding agriculture and farming. So glad that you could make it. You are actually what makes our work possible. So just want to extend our thanks to you for attending, for being engaged with our work in the Lancaster County community, and for your support of all that we're doing every day to ensure that agriculture is sustained. So thank you. Today we have an interesting program for all of you. We have our Chief Operating Officer, Jeff Swinehart, as well as our Director of Land Protection here to talk a little bit about how Lancaster Farmland Trust protects and upholds our easements. We've preserved 513 farms and over 31,000 acres of farmland in Lancaster County, and all of those farms are preserved in perpetuity, which means they are preserved forever into the unforeseeable future. So that means that we have a significant responsibility to our farmers and also to our community to ensure that those easements are upheld in perpetuity. So interesting topic today. Just a few housekeeping issues, and then we'll get on to the good stuff. You're all currently on mute, but we'd love to hear from you if you have questions or comments. We'll have time during the program for you to pose your questions, but you can also pose those questions in the question box or in the chat box. So feel free to do that. We love to have engagement from folks in attendance. The session is also being recorded, so it will be offered after this on our YouTube channel. As well as you'll receive the link in the email that gets sent to you after this webinar. And so at this time, I'm going to hand it over to our Chief Operating Officer, Jeff Swinehart, to begin the program. Jeff?
Great, thank you, Amanda. And welcome everyone. We really appreciate your time and interest in this topic. As you can see on the screen there, we're going to be discussing Terra Firma. And we'll dive into that a little bit, but it's really important to note that what we'll be covering related to Terra Firma really is only needed for the most severe and significant violations of conservation easements, which at the Trust we experience very few of. And later on in the program, Jeb will review technical and minor and major violations and how we decipher between the two. So we do not utilize Terra Firma often, although it is there for us. It is an insurance program. One of the other real benefits of Terra Firma is the level of knowledge and experience of the folks who are really managing the entity. We have access to professionals across the entire United States to really provide guidance when we're faced with a violation of an easement and how to reach a resolution of that. So for today, just to go over an agenda, we'll talk a little bit about what Terra Firma is, the history of the organization, the structure of it, some statistics related to claims and number of land trusts that participate in the program. And then Jeb will pick it up from there and present on the stewardship efforts that we take really to mitigate violations and to uphold our legal responsibility of stewarding and enforcing the provisions of our conservation easements. And then we also have a case study related to a major violation that the Trust experienced some years ago that predated Terra Firma, but I think it's really a good example of how the insurance program would have provided coverage in that particular example. So Terra Firma, it is a risk retention group. And you might be wondering, what is a risk retention group? A risk retention group is a state chartered insurance company that insures commercial businesses and government entities against liability risks. So it's different than your typical insurance company. It's also defined as what's called a captive insurance company, which means it's owned by the members of the insurance company. It's not publicly traded or doesn't have shareholders. The shareholders really would be the land trust members who pay their premiums to receive the insurance coverage. And also Terra Firma is chartered in the state of Vermont. So Terra Firma is not owned by the Land Trust Alliance, and you may be wondering, if you're not in the world of land trust often, you might be wondering, who is the Land Trust Alliance? The Land Trust Alliance is a national organization based in Washington, D.C. that develops standards and practices for land trusts, works at the federal level on policy and funding. It also launched the Land Trust Accreditation Commission in 2008 and spearheaded the efforts to conceptualize an insurance program for land trusts. Terra Firma was started in 2013 with $4 million capitalized, which was a requirement of the regulators. Since 2013, at the first opportunity, Lancaster Farmland Trust enrolled our entire easement portfolio in the program and has been enrolled in the program ever since. The trust has the largest portfolio that's enrolled at Terra Firma when compared to the other 528 land trust owners of Terra Firma. Some have considerable more acreage, like in the West, where land trusts are protecting, as an example, a 20,000 acre ranch under one conservation easement. Here on the East Coast, our properties are generally smaller in size. Our average farm size is 62 acres. What this means is Lancaster Farmland Trust assumes more risk when we protect land. And you can think about that in the context of that people cause violations. Land doesn't divide itself, buildings don't magically appear, and trees don't cut themselves down. People do all of that. We have 500 plus landowners that we need to worry about, and we need to worry about all the neighbors around those preserved farms. Terra Firma is comprised of 7 different regions across the United States, each having a member elected by the land trust in that region to represent the region on the members committee, which is the governing body of the organization. There is also one at-large member for a total members committee of 8 people. I have had the privilege of being the representative of the Mid-Atlantic region elected by the land trust in that region in 2018. And I'm currently serving the second year of a 3-year term. It's also important to note that Terra Firma also has an 8-person claims committee to review and make determination whether claims will be covered for that policy holder. The membership on this committee is attorneys and insurance experts, and there are no term limits associated with it. It's really important to have that consistency of the knowledge and depth of the knowledge related to easement violations, some which become highly complex and very cumbersome to work through a litigation process. So Terra Firma is not property insurance, since it's property insurance that we all may have on a piece of property that we own. It's liability insurance. It's a very specialized type of liability insurance for organizations that have a legal duty to defend conservation values. It provides insurance coverage for land trusts when there's a violation of the easement and the land trust needs to go to court to reach a resolution. The coverage pays for attorney's fees and fees associated with expert witnesses. The policy provides for an annual aggregate limit of $500,000 per member land trust. Each claim also has a $500,000 maximum limit. So in theory, one land trust may file a claim and could reach their maximum coverage limit in that one particular year. Those maximum limits are really rare, and there's only been very few, less than 5, I would say, over the past 7 years across the entire United States that have reached that maximum limit. For Lancaster Farmland Trust, our annual aggregate limit is $1 million due to the size of our portfolio. And then when a claim is filed, there is a deductible of $5,000 that is required by the policy. So Terra Firma is not just for precedent-setting cases. It really is a safety net. And what this means is that the insured owner members of Terra Firma have an insurance policy with a covered definition, claim definition, as well as explicit exclusions from coverage. And one of those, a good example is, for instance, condemnation. A taking by way of condemnation is not a covered claim under this insurance program. Terra Firma helps protect land trusts from the risk of unplanned legal expenses. And again, it's a safety net, but it's not a substitute for adequate reserves and risk management. In addition to the Terra Firma insurance policy, Lancaster Farmland Trust also has a Stewardship Fund, for the stewardship and defense of conservation easements that we hold. Currently, the fund is at $4.5 million. We were at just over $5 million prior to COVID-19, so we've seen a little bit of decline based on what's happened in the market. But we do have current efforts underway to increase the fund to $7.5 million. And that number was based on a 30-year forward-looking analysis that Vanguard completed for us, where the fund is invested. And based on that analysis, that $7.5 million would ensure that Lancaster Farmland Trust has adequate resources to steward and enforce our conservation easements over the next 30 years. Looking at forecasting into the future, it's really hard to look beyond 30 years because there's just not good data out there. So that's the best analysis that we could look at. Obviously, our obligation is perpetual. It will run forever, much longer than 30 years. And we look at this on an annual basis of what the current balance is in our fund, what the market has done, how much we need to take out of the fund to support either stewardship or enforcement issues, and then incorporate that into our fundraising strategy moving forward. Annually, our staff also participates in risk management courses that are offered by Terra Firma to mitigate the prospects of easement violations. So the program is not just for conservation easements, it really covers all conservation. Terra Firma ensures the conservation rights of land under easement and land that land trusts either own, as well as land that may be available for public access, such as public trails. At Lancaster Farmland Trust, we only hold conservation easements. We don't own any land other than where our office building physically is at, although many land trusts do own land for public access. We can also ensure easements that are jointly held with the Lancaster County Ag Preserve Board or another partner that we may hold an easement jointly with. And just looking at some statistics here in terms of some graphs, you can see that the program started in 2013. And this past year, this is the most recent data that we have, 2019, it increased the membership of the number of land trusts participating from 420 to 529. You can also see that the acres protected under the program that receive the insurance coverage has also increased pretty substantially from 6.3 million acres in 2013 to almost 9 million acres last year. And then the parcels that are covered. So these are the individual parcels, either subject to a conservation easement or owned in fee by that particular land trust, 20,500 in 2013 and over 31,000 in 2019. So what this means is more land trusts are participating in the program, which means more land has insurance coverage. And the result is better protection for preserved land. And also ensuring that if there are challenges and they go to litigation, the insurance coverage provides some certainty or at least some better reassurance that there won't be any bad case law that gets established because the land trust may not have had adequate resources to appropriately defend a conservation easement at the level that they would need to. And you can see here, this is the membership by state, again, from 2019. You can see in the far west in California, there's great participation by land trusts there. And then really in the northeast in New England region is where there's also the greatest participation. It's really where you see the sort of centralization of land trusts. Many in the northeast and especially in the New England region might be based on a particular town or a small geography, whereas out west, you have land trusts that are covering much larger geographic areas, entire states or multiple states, as an example. Related to Pennsylvania, there's approximately 80 land trusts in Pennsylvania, and 27 of those land trusts are members of Terra Firma. On this slide, again, representative of claims that were filed in 2019. There was a total of 596 claims that were filed. As you can see there, the bulk of the claims are related to conservation easements. with a very small portion, actually only about 7% of claims are filed by land trusts related to land that they own in fee. You can also see that the paid losses are a little higher with conservation easements on a per parcel basis. So these are, again, losses paid out, and losses being those compensation is being paid to the attorneys to provide the assistance to the particular land trust. Here you can see this graph shows the challengers by year, really related for significant challenges. And you can see there that successor landowners and third-party trespass really rise to the top virtually every year. And you might be wondering, what is a successor landowner? And we classify that as someone who owns the property after the original grantor of the easement. So the property was preserved subject to an easement, then sold and acquired by someone, and that person then we define as a successor landowner. For the trust, we have many landowners who still own the farm that they preserved, but we also have some properties that we hold easements on that are on their third or fourth successor landowner. And the case study that Jeb will cover later actually highlights a really good example of a successor landowner violation. And it's really a roll of the dice when a property gets sold either privately or goes up for public auction. We don't know who that new owner is going to be. We don't know their opinions or perspective related to farmland preservation. At times we've experienced, maybe even greater commitment to the farm being preserved. And we've also experienced, those who weren't as excited to know that their farm was subject to a conservation easement, even though it's it's included in the title of the property. They're made aware of it before they own it. We still find we have people who are buying farms because they either felt compelled to buy it or it was the adjacent farm to an existing property that they own, and they might not be as supportive of the farm being preserved as we would have liked. And then the last slide here before I pass it off to Jeb just really highlights the different types of claims that are covered and sort of the volumes of those. As you can see here, prohibited divisions, so subdivisions of properties, as well as grazing and harvesting. And the grazing and harvesting is really most relevant for out west in grazing lands, but those are the most significant, and you can see, followed by trespass there by a close third or second. So a lot of different variations of claims that can be covered. So with this, I'm going to stop here and make Jeb the presenter, and then he'll take us through the efforts that we do at the trust related to stewardship, and then review the case study.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So as Jeff mentioned, so I'm gonna cover at least initially here. I'm gonna cover our role when it comes to stewarding easements and some steps that we take to make sure that our easements are upheld, and ultimately then allows us to not have to tap into that safety net insurance program that Jeff mentioned. So if any of you were on a webinar a few weeks ago, some of this might be familiar, so it might be a refresher for you. But just want to highlight some of those preventative measures. So, and this might not necessarily cover everything that we do, but these are kind of the main ones. So the first and foremost, and by far, I think the most important way that we steward our easements and prevent potential violations is the annual monitoring of all of our easements. So we have 513 farms preserved, and with permitted subdivisions that have occurred over the years, we monitor 574 individual properties on an annual basis, once per calendar year. So that's a big lift for our staff, as well as a wonderful set of volunteers that we have. And it's by and large one of the most effective ways that we make sure our easements are upheld. Also going to cover kind of ongoing communications that we have with landowners, ongoing communications we have with land use professionals that cross paths with landowners and do a lot of work on the farms on which we hold easements. And we'll touch briefly on some different technology that we utilize. So our annual easement monitoring, as I mentioned, 574 properties that we're monitoring annually. The map on your screen just is a countywide view at all of our preserved farms. So this doesn't include Lancaster County's preserved farms, just the ones that Lancaster Farmland Trust holds. And all of the properties we're responsible for visiting it, whether that be in person or you'll see in a second, we have some remote monitoring options as well, once per year. So how does that annual monitoring visit look? It really starts prior to the actual site assessment itself. Our staff is, one, contacting the landowner, letting them know that we're going to be doing that monitoring visit. Gives the landowner a chance to make themselves available if they wish to have a conversation with us about their property. Also, we're available for them to ask any questions they might have about changes they're looking to make to their property. Prior to those inspections, we're also checking at the Lancaster Courthouse, really on their online platform. We check each property, check for any kind of changes that may have come up from in the title. So we're looking for, have any rights of ways been granted? And we're just checking to make sure that nothing kind of fishy is showing up at the courthouse. And it gives us a good kind of base to start from. Like I mentioned, sending those letters during the actual visit. So if it's an on-site, on-farm visit, we like to speak with the landowner or the farmer for a few minutes just to verify, in their opinion, what has changed over the last year on their property, and then we can confirm with a visual inspection. If we're doing a remote monitoring visit where we're not actually visiting the property in person, we will, our hope is to still be able to speak to the landowner, whether that be over the phone during the visit or prior to. We're inspecting the property and we're documenting any changes and comparing how those changes may be impacted by the easement provisions. 99% of the time, a change is permitted, and it's really just documenting that the landowner constructed an addition on their barn, and we're just documenting that type of thing. And then we send an annual report to the landowner. They get a copy, we keep a copy, and that just serves as a record of that annual inspection. So I mentioned that we do kind of remote visits in addition to our in-person visits. So Jeff mentioned the Land Trust Alliance, the accreditation commission that was launched through the Land Trust Alliance. They have a set of standards and practices that accredited land trusts follow. And one of those standards is related to the aerial monitoring of properties. So whether it be if a land trust has a drone or a land trust has purchased aerial imagery or is contracted with a pilot or something along those lines, if the land trust has the ability to obtain current aerial imagery of a property, they're permitted to monitor that property using that aerial imagery for 4 consecutive years. And then that 5th year, they're required to actually go out and do that in-person site assessment, walking around the property. This is a relatively new development for Lancaster Farmland Trust. We, historically have done all of our visits in person. So prior to COVID-19, we were exploring this a little bit, but really due to COVID-19, it really allowed us to explore some of these possibilities in a little bit more detail, wanting to give our staff and volunteers some options to work from home. So the screenshot here is from a program that we use that allows us to obtain imagery And actually, it has the white line coming down the middle has a slider feature that you can kind of slide back and forth from March 2019 imagery to March 2020 imagery. Obviously, you can zoom in and those type of things, and then you can compare what changes may have occurred. And if there's something that draws your attention, like a new building that appears to be not part of the farm operation, or if you just have a question about it, then you can flag that, give the landowner a call, and get some clarification on that. And if there was something that's really unclear, we don't know what it is, and we really need to go out and verify it, at that time, we then could still go out and visit the property. So outside of annual monitoring, we're still communicating with our landowners variety of times throughout the year. Jeff mentioned successive landowners, so we have quite a few of those owning our preserved farms. So whether it be a private sale or an auction, our goal is to communicate as effectively as possible with those involved, not only the new buyers, but realtors, attorneys, those types of things. So if we're made aware that there is an auction coming up of one of our preserved farms, our staff attends those auctions with hopes of getting to a few minutes to meet with the new landowner, just to if nothing else, introduce ourselves, who we are, and then a lot of times during auctions you don't have a whole lot of time to sit down and explain the provisions of an easement, but you at least can introduce yourself, say hello. And I'd say this has moderate success rate. Other times that we communicate with our landowners are, if a landowner initiates that conversation. So most of our landowners obviously are aware that their farms are preserved, and they're aware that when they make significant changes to their property, that they need to contact us. So oftentimes the landowner is the one contacting us saying, hey, here's what I'm thinking about doing. Am I permitted to do so, and what are the restrictions around that? So a good example is a subdivision. A lot of our easements allow for maybe one farm subdivision to occur in the future. Some don't, some do. So it's really a case-by-case basis. And so landowners will call in and say, I'm looking to sell 20 acres to my brother. Am I permitted to do that? And our staff will review that with them. This is the best case scenario. Doesn't happen all the time, but it's nice when it does. We also send mailings out to our landowners on an as-needed basis as we see kind of trends in the land use community in Lancaster County, but also statewide, countrywide, and we feel it's important for us to get the message out to our landowners about a certain trend that may be occurring, whether it be solar development or other infrastructure projects, or even grant opportunities. We like to stay in touch with our farmers, our landowners. Outside of communicating with landowners, because we recognize that our farmers are busy folks, and sometimes, unfortunately, they may not think to call us and check and see if a project they're working on is approved or is a permitted use on a preserved farm. But oftentimes there are other kind of professionals they need to work with when they're preparing some of these, preparing plans for some of these projects, whether it be a subdivision or a new house or a sideline business on their farm. They a lot of times will need to go through municipal approval, whether it be a zoning approval or they need some sort of permit. A lot of times they're working with surveyors or engineers if they're subdividing the property, or they're needing to design some sort of stormwater controls for a new barn or something like that. So a lot of times we're contacted by either township staff or private engineering companies, other land use professionals that see a lot of these projects come across their desks, and if they're aware that farm is preserved, they can then contact us to make sure that we're in the loop on it. So we try our best to build strong relationships with those types of individuals throughout the county, recognizing that our work it's mutual. The work that we're doing, it's mutually important to both of us. So it's important that we communicate. So some examples of folks we work with in Lancaster County to steward these easements. So surveyors, like I mentioned, realtors, auctioneers, and the County Planning Commission. So we're kind of blessed and unique in a sense in Lancaster County, in that the Lancaster County Planning Commission does review a lot of subdivision plans and new land development plans that are occurring on properties in Lancaster County. And we have a good relationship with the Lancaster County Planning Commission, and their staff will contact our staff when they get a plan across their desk for a preserved farm, and really to make sure that we're aware of it and to see if we're okay with it. So if for whatever reason, and it happens from time to time, if for whatever reason our preventative stewardship measures they don't work and a violation occurs, there are two kind of main buckets of violations in the land trust world. First one being a minor, or sometimes called a technical violation. These are violations that are truly minor in nature. They don't diminish the conservation value of the easement. You know, there's no real detriment to ag soils or open space or water resources on the property. They do not require litigation. Typically, there's a pretty easily agreed upon solution between the land trust and the landowner. It's a relatively easy process, and typically costs are pretty low. And then on the other side of that, there's major violations where the opposite, conservation values diminished in some sense, either largely or moderately, requires greater resources, both in staff time and monetary resources. Often litigation is required. Resolution may not be met outside of court, more difficult to find a common solution, and more expensive. So an example of a minor or technical violation, and one that we do see from time to time, I don't know exactly off the top of my head what % of our farms we see this on, but is the example of when a farm is transferring ownership, our easements require that in any new deed that's recorded, that there needs to be some language inserted into that deed that states this farm is preserved through Lancaster Farmland Trust, and you can find that easement at the county courthouse under docket number 12345. So we require that there's a reference to the easement number at the courthouse within the language, just so it's clear when somebody looks up the deed to that property that farm is subject to an easement. So from time to time, you know, a lot of farm transfers in Lancaster County, maybe they're going from parent to son, father to son. You know, it's kind of a quick transfer, and this may unfortunately get missed, and the deed gets recorded, and there's no reference to our easement. It doesn't mean the farm's not preserved anymore. If a title searcher were to pull the title for the property, they would see the easement on the title. It still is subject to the easement. It just is not quite as clear to maybe your average Joe that might be pulling the deed. So our preferred resolution in that case is the landowner agrees to record a deed of correction to include that deed language. It's a relatively inexpensive fix. It's a little bit more paperwork for everybody, but all in all, in the grand scheme of things, not really that big of a deal. And then on the other side of things, we have major violation. And this example is, as Jeff mentioned, this is a real example on one of our farms. Happened in the late, 2008 it began. So this was classified as a major violation. And as Jeff mentioned, it predates Terra Firma. So some of these costs that would have been covered typically by Terra Firma, if this were to happen today, were not covered because the Terra Firma did not exist at this time. So this is an example of a major violation, and really it was kind of multiple violations in one. The landowner constructed without our knowledge, constructed a large shop that was to be used for a business use. The business was a horse barn fabrication business. They would build horse barns in here and then sell them to other folks off the property. Kind of accompanying the construction of this building, from a township's point of view, they were required to reconfigure the lot line a little bit in order to allow for the driveway to come in. So there was an impermissible land swap with the neighbor, where they traded some land that was preserved with some non-preserved land, which you can't do. So it was kind of two different violations in one there. So the easement did not allow for an on-farm business use of that size and scale. The preferred resolution for us is we want it back to the way it was, we want it back to farming. Landowner removes the building, or another option would be that this building is converted to some sort of agricultural use. It's retrofitted to be able to store hay that they're cutting from the fields on this farm, or they have some animals in there, or what may be. And in any scenario, it's going to be a fairly expensive cost for everybody involved. So the picture there on the right is actually it actually is a picture of that building that was constructed on that farm. This picture here is another picture of the same building a few years later, and you'll understand why there are a bunch of cars out in front of it in a little bit. So the key issues here were, this is a large commercial building that was constructed, and that's on a preserved farm, generally not permitted. Another issue is the landowner, in kind of fault aside, landowner invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into this building. And throughout that process had to go through multiple different steps with any lenders, attorneys, neighbors, municipal officials, engineers, all sorts of individuals that saw this project. And unfortunately, Lancaster Farmland Trust was never made aware of it until it was already really underway. And as I mentioned, another kind of issue is it predates Terra Firma. So this is my kind of best effort at it was a very long and drug out issue, so I tried to simplify as much as possible. But in 2008 was when this violation was originally discovered, really actually from a conversation we were having with a neighbor related to a different farm, and they just kind of mentioned this in passing, and our staff went out and just because it kind of piqued our interest a little bit, went out and checked it out, and sure enough, discovered that this was a violation. So our first step, as with any violation, is we want to gather as much information as possible. We want to discuss, make sure we're clear on what exactly is going on. Is this just, we want to avoid falling into the rumor mill, and we want to get, hear the landowner, what's we see you constructed a new building, what's this being used for, et cetera, et cetera. So we have conversations with the landowner after we discovered what we believe to be a violation, confirms that the use is not something that's consistent or permitted within the easement. So then we are realizing that this is becoming a little bit of a larger issue. The landowner was unwilling to convert or remove the building initially. So we really could feel ourselves, and with conversations with our attorney, kind of confirmed our suspicions that this is indeed a violation. We could feel that this was going to end up being kind of a big deal, and likely would have some PR implications that came along with it. So our staff felt that it was important to get some communications out there in the community, and probably spent a few years really communicating this type of thing, really so that if we would indeed have to take this landowner to court, which you'll see we did, that it was kind of our last ditch effort. So we worked on that communication strategy for a while. The building remained unpermitted. So we did end up filing a case with the Court of Common Pleas. And actually in the courtroom, prior to kind of the hearing beginning, the Lancaster Farmland Trust actually reached a settlement with the landowners in the courtroom. The building, the landowner, sorry, I'm jumping ahead there. Landowner reached a settlement. So move on from there. Time goes by a little bit after that meeting, and the building just still does not come down or change use. Fast forward about 4 years after the original violation was discovered, our staff was now made aware and confirmed that now the business, while maybe not being used for building horse barns, commercial horse barns, is now being rented out and being used by a towing business, which is that all of those vehicles you saw in the previous picture. So still a commercial use, still not permitted within the easement. So long story short, we end up back in court. This time the judge orders the landowners to remove the building in 30 days. So a little bit more of a, we didn't reach an agreement with them. This is an order by a judge. You need to take this building down or convert it, and you have 30 days to do it. And also ordered that the landowner was responsible to pay all of our court fees, so our attorney's fees, which over these many years, all of our costs had obviously built up to an amount that was decently sizable. So the building was removed. The amount that was owed to the trust was not paid, and a lien was placed on the property in the amount the landowner owed the trust in that settlement. And only until 2018, that lien was on the property, and then finally in 2018, that lien was paid off. So you can see over a 10-year period that this was kind of a back and forth situation, and obviously it's it's the trust's last option is to take a landowner to court, but ultimately it's our responsibility to uphold these easements. It's our responsibility to the public. It's our responsibility to our mission of farmland preservation in Lancaster County, and ultimately the landowner had the ability to, whether they did or not, had the ability to take a tax deduction when they granted the easement on this property. So the IRS has some, some interest in the situation too. So that's kind of all I have. I think I'll pass it back to either Amanda or Jeff and see if we have any questions.
Great, thanks, Jeb, and thanks, Jeff, for that presentation. Some very technical information and interesting information. So again, just a reminder to anybody that's attending, if you do have a question, and I just saw one pop up from Dave Hendel here, to enter it into the chat box or just let us know. And so let's see, Dave has a question. He said, I may have missed it, but in the case study, was the violator the original grantee?
Dave, this is Jeb here. He was not. So he was. He actually. So this farm was subdivided, which was permitted in an amended easement. So occasionally an easement will be amended. A subdivision was preserved. So this was a portion of the original farm that was then sold to a successive landowner.
And Jeb, I'll just add to that. I think as many know in the Plainside community, the families are very close, and this particular landowner was the fourth successive landowner, but his uncle was the original grantor of the easement. And while we were doing our outreach to the community and had a conversation with his uncle, the original grantor of the easement, at which time he told me that when his nephew proposed this building and the use, he indicated to him that he did not think it was permitted under the conservation easement, and that he really needed to reach out to us. Obviously, the landowner did. It was interesting going through this process because the personality of this particular individual really shone through. And I think there was an element of, he had a vision and a dream that he had for this property, and nothing was going to get in his way from that happening. And unfortunately, it was, unfortunately for him, it was, is subject to a conservation easement, and the trust had the obligation to enforce that easement.
Great. So another question for both of you. You've mentioned some situations where there were violations on easements, and it sounds like in the future there's potential for challenges to easements to increase. So could you both talk about a little bit about the main reasons for this increase and how Lancaster Farmland Trust is addressing them?
Well, I think there's a few relevant issues there. Again, as we went over, the experience at Terra Firma is that successor landowners cause more violations of easements than the original grantors do. And the trust now being 32 years old, while we've seen some properties change ownership multiple times, we still have some properties that are owned by the original grantor. But as they mature and they start looking about transferring, wealth and the property assets that they have, and we know over the next, 15 to 20 years, there will be substantial wealth in terms of land assets that are transferred in Lancaster County, because the age of our farmers is, 62, 63 years old as an average age. So we anticipate that there will be more challenges based on those dynamics. I think another element that comes into play is, Lancaster County is a great place to live. Has been noted many times in different publications about the great quality of life, close proximity to large metropolitan areas, easy access with the Amtrak line to get to Philadelphia and other places, and recognizing the county is going to grow by close to 120,000 people over the next 20 years. All of that's going to apply pressure, whether it's a residential development that gets constructed adjacent to a preserved farm, and challenges that might arise out of that, whether it's developers who decide that they're going to buy a piece of property that's subject to an easement and see whether or not they can actually challenge that easement and break that easement. So I think we expect it to be on a rise.
Great. Jeff, can you talk a little bit about, you had mentioned previously that the trust has a stewardship fund. Can you explain how that fund is funded?
Yes. So our stewardship fund was started back in probably about I'm going to say the mid to late 90s at this point, by one of our board members at that point in time, who really recognized this perpetual obligation that the organization has. And started that fund. Obviously, it started out small. Landowners who were preserving at that point in time were not required to make a cash contribution to that. And the organization was putting in, a couple $100. I think it started out as $250 per every easement transaction. But we do have policies that guide funds to the stewardship fund. So as an example, if someone, by way of their estate, make a bequest to the trust and leave something remainder, maybe it's a remainder of an IRA or something within their estate property that they owned, our internal policy requires that 90% of that bequest actually goes into the stewardship fund. And in say probably the early 2000s, we had a property owner that we didn't know who actually left us his farm. The board decided to grant to put a conservation easement on that and permanently preserve it. And then we put it up for public auction, which was sold by a neighboring farmer who bought it. The proceeds of that, which were $600,000, were then all invested into the stewardship fund. Fast forward, as the organization really starts to identify the stewardship obligations, and as our portfolio grows, the board recognizing the need to grow the size of our stewardship fund, the organization started investing more on an individual transaction basis. Jumped up to $500, jumped up to $1,000, jumped up to $2,000. Currently, we're at $4,000 that we invest in the Stewardship Fund from dollars that our supporters provide to us for every easement that we acquire. And now, probably 11 years ago, the board approved a policy where landowners who are receiving a cash consideration for the preservation of their farm must also make a contribution to the Stewardship Fund. And those contributions average about $6,500 per easement transaction. So currently now, like around $10,000 or so for every easement the Stewardship Fund. Amanda?
Oh, Jeff, I'm sorry, I lost you there for a second. Apologize. All right. I apologize for the audio that went out there. Did we finish up on that last question?
I did. The only thing I would add is, as the organization looks at opportunities, recognizing we have significant waiting list of farms to preserve, also looking at the stewardship obligations that come along with that. So in every effort where we are raising dollars to acquire easements on preserved farms, we're simultaneously looking at the stewardship obligations and directing those funds into that stewardship fund to make sure that the organization does have adequate resources moving into the future.
Wonderful. One last question. And again, please type your questions into the chat box if you have them. One last question for you is, you mentioned that relationships are critical to good stewardship. Can you talk a little bit about how we've preserved relationships during easement violations?
Jeb, I'll take this one. I mean, related to the case study that Jeb reviewed, we had a lot of concerns at that point in time. It was a member of the Plainset community. Understanding the severity of the issue, the organization was concerned about how would the Plainset community view the actions of Lancaster Farmland Trust. So we did a tremendous amount of outreach in terms of reaching out to close contacts we had in the Plainset community. Some were, some of those individuals were past board members. Some were current board members that we got their advice from. We reached out to some of the leaders in that particular community to get their input and get their guidance, and worked over the course of probably 3 years of trying to convince the landowner to move down a different path. Let's figure out a solution here that doesn't end up with this going into litigation and through the court process. So we constantly we were doing that community outreach throughout the entire time to really understand that community's opinion and perspective of the actions that Lancaster Farmland Trust was taking. I would say in that particular case, it became clear to us after some time of doing that outreach that the community was not stepping up to help this individual, which is pretty rare in the Plainset community. If there's a member of that community that's in trouble or needs some help, generally the community will rally around that individual, but they weren't around this one particular person, which started to send a message to us that it really started to convey the community's opinion of this individual. And when we recognized and realized that, I think we reached a point where we became much more comfortable to move this ahead, understanding the implications of it, but also recognizing that we did a lot of outreach to the community to try to get their opinions and perspectives on this. Jeff, anything else to add there?
No, not really. I mean, I'd say, we sometimes can it can come across as repetitive, but that's why we like to kind of have those continued conversations every year with landowners to so that that they're very aware that we are active about the stewardship of our farms rather than passive.
Great. Thank you for answering those questions, Jeff and Jeb. And thanks to all of you. I don't see any more questions in the chat, so I think we're going to wrap it up. But appreciate you being with us today. Thanks also to Jeff Swinehart and Jeb Musser for presenting. The webinar will be available after this. You'll receive the link in the email that you receive after we're done here, so that you can view it, and please share it. And if you are able, please consider a contribution to Lancaster Farmland Trust. I know many of you on the line today are already supporters, so thank you for that. We're currently conducting our Long Live Local campaign to preserve 5 farms before the end of June. We're raising funds there. We're about 30% of the way there, so we'd love if you would consider supporting Lancaster Farmland Trust through that effort. And again, thanks for being with us today. We'll see you in June. Our next webinar will be, you'll receive an email about that in the middle of June, June 16th, about some issues related to the dairy industry. So we hope that you can join us then, and have a great day.